Hey everyone, tonight we're exploring one of the most misunderstood and marginalised aspects of medieval society, the lives of women who engaged in transactional intimacy as a means of survival. This is a topic that requires sensitivity, respect, and historical honesty. These were real people navigating difficult circumstances in a world that offered them few choices and even less dignity. Before we begin this thoughtful examination of a challenging subject, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these deeper explorations of history's hidden corners resonate with you. Feel free to share in the comments where everyone is watching from tonight. It's always wonderful to see this global community. Now, settle in comfortably, and let's explore together the reality of medieval lives lived on society's margins, approaching this topic with the respect and understanding that historical distance allows us to bring. When modern people think about medieval society, they often imagine a world neatly divided into nobles, clergy, merchants, artisans, and peasants. But medieval communities, like all human societies, were more complex than simple categories suggest. Among the people who don't fit into tidy social boxes were women who exchanged intimate companionship for money, individuals whose lives were shaped by poverty, limited options, social stigma, and the harsh realities of survival in an unforgiving world. Understanding their experiences requires setting aside modern assumptions and judgments. Medieval attitudes towards such women were complex and often contradictory. Religious authorities condemned their profession as sinful, while simultaneously acknowledging it as a social reality that wasn't going away. Civil authorities oscillated between prohibition and regulation, sometimes attempting to eliminate such activity, and other times simply trying to control and tax it. Society at large stigmatized these women while also creating the demand that sustained their trade. The women themselves, and the occasional men who engaged in similar work, were individuals with their own stories, motivations, and humanity. Some entered this life through desperation, having exhausted all other options for survival. Others were born into it, daughters following mothers in the only trade they knew. Still others were forced into it through coercion or trafficking. A few may have chosen it as the least terrible option among limited choices. Whatever their paths, they all faced daily challenges that would test anyone's resilience and resourcefulness. This exploration isn't an endorsement or a moral judgment. It's simply an attempt to understand how medieval people actually lived, including those whose lives took them to society's margins. These women existed. They had experiences worth understanding, and their stories are part of the fuller picture of medieval life that often gets overlooked in favour of kings, knights, and grand narratives. To understand why women engaged in transactional intimacy during the medieval period, we must first understand the economic realities that shaped their choices. Medieval society offered women remarkably few ways to support themselves independently. The economic options available to men, various trades, manual labour, military service, clergy, were largely closed to women. The respectable paths for women were essentially marriage, entering religious life as a nun, or working in domestic service. But what happened to women who fell outside these narrow paths? Widows without families to support them, women rejected by or fleeing from abusive husbands, orphaned girls with no relatives willing to take them in, women whose families were too poor to provide dowries for marriage or convent entry, refugees displaced by war or famine. All of these women faced genuinely desperate circumstances. The wage gap between men and women was enormous. Women working in legitimate trades, spinning, brewing, laundry, domestic service, earned a fraction of what men earned for comparable work. A woman working full-time at spinning might earn enough to buy bread for herself but struggle to afford shelter, clothing, and other necessities. The mathematics of survival simply didn't work for many women attempting to support themselves through legitimate labour alone. For a woman facing starvation, homelessness, or watching her children go hungry, exchanging intimacy for money offered immediate income that legitimate work couldn't match. A single transaction might earn what several days of spinning would bring. This stark economic reality drove many women to make choices they might not have made in better circumstances. The cycle was often vicious. Once a woman gained a reputation for this activity, legitimate employment became even harder to obtain. Respectable families wouldn't hire servants with such backgrounds. Guilds that controlled most urban trades wouldn't accept women of questionable reputation. Even churches that might have provided charity were reluctant to help women viewed as sinful. The social stigma effectively trapped women in this lifestyle as returning to respectable society became nearly impossible. Some women attempted to combine legitimate work with occasional transactions to supplement inadequate income. A laundress or alewife might accept payment for intimacy from particular clients, using this additional income to make ends meet. This grey area was common, with many women moving back and forth between different economic activities as circumstances demanded. The geography of poverty and opportunity also mattered. Urban areas, with their concentrations of men, soldiers, merchants, travellers, labourers, created demand and opportunity. Cities attracted women from surrounding countryside who saw urban areas as offering better survival chances than rural poverty. This rural to urban migration of desperate women was a recognised pattern that contemporary observers noted, though they typically blamed the women rather than the economic structures that created such desperation. Prices for services varied enormously depending on circumstances, location, the woman's age and appearance, and clients' means. Women working in established houses might receive a portion of fees paid to house operators. Those working independently kept all earnings but faced greater risks and less stability. The poorest women, often older or less attractive by contemporary standards, might accept minimal payments simply to eat that day. The economic hierarchy among these women was as stratified as society itself. Debt was another pathway into this life. Women who borrowed money for emergencies, illness, rent, food during hard times, and couldn't repay might be coerced by creditors into working in houses to satisfy debts. This debt bondage was recognised as problematic even by medieval standards, but enforcement of protections was inconsistent at best. Some women spent years working to pay off debts that never seemed to diminish, trapped in exploitative arrangements that resembled slavery. The lack of economic alternatives cannot be overstated. Modern people with numerous career options, social safety nets, and legal protections may struggle to imagine a world where a woman's choices might genuinely be limited to starvation, theft, entering this trade, or similar desperate measures. But for many medieval women, these were the actual choices available. Understanding this context doesn't excuse the exploitation and harm these women faced, but it does help explain how intelligent, capable individuals ended up in such difficult circumstances. Where and how these women lived varied tremendously depending on their circumstances, location, and the degree of organisation or regulation in their communities. The living conditions ranged from relatively structured arrangements to situations of severe deprivation and danger. In many medieval towns and cities, authorities attempted to regulate this activity by confining it to specific areas or establishments. These designated districts, sometimes called by various euphemistic names, were meant to contain the activity where it could be monitored and taxed, while keeping it away from respectable neighbourhoods. Women working in these areas often lived in houses specifically designated for this purpose, sometimes owned by the municipal government, sometimes by private operators. The houses themselves varied in quality but were rarely comfortable or pleasant. A typical establishment might be a 2- or 3-storey building divided into small rooms, private chambers where women met clients. These rooms were minimally furnished, usually containing just a bed, perhaps a small table or chair, and little else. The goal was function, not comfort. Windows, if they existed, were small and often shuttered to provide privacy. Multiple women would live and work in the same house, creating crowded conditions where privacy was minimal. The women might share sleeping quarters separate from the working rooms, or in more cramped establishments, they might sleep in the same rooms where they worked. Personal space was essentially non-existent, and tensions between women competing for clients or simply trying to coexist in difficult circumstances were common. The operators of these houses, sometimes called by various titles, were often women themselves, frequently former workers who had accumulated enough money to establish their own businesses. These madams had complete authority over the women working under them, controlling access to clients, setting prices, taking substantial portions of earnings, and maintaining house rules. The relationship could be exploitative, with operators extracting as much money as possible from their workers while providing minimal support or protection. Living in an established house offered certain advantages over independent work. There was some security in numbers. Multiple women, and perhaps doorkeepers or guards, provided protection that isolated women lacked. The house itself offered shelter, however basic, and establishments with reputations for safety and quality might attract wealthier clients willing to pay more, potentially improving women's earnings. However, house living also meant giving up autonomy. Women couldn't choose their clients, couldn't refuse work when they were ill or exhausted, couldn't keep all their earnings, and couldn't leave without settling accounts with the house operator. Some operators kept women in debt through inflated charges for room, board, clothing, and other necessities, creating situations where workers could never save enough to leave. Women working independently faced different challenges. Without the structure of an established house, they had to find clients on their own, usually by working streets in areas known for this activity. They had to arrange their own accommodations, perhaps renting a small room, sharing space with other women in similar circumstances, or in the worst cases, conducting transactions in alleys, doorways, or other semi-public spaces that offered minimal shelter and no security. Independent work offered more control. Women kept all their earnings and could, in theory, choose which clients to accept. However, they also faced all the risks alone. Violence from clients was a constant danger. Theft of their meagre possessions was common, and they had no one to turn to for protection or support. The vulnerability of women working alone was recognised even in medieval times, and such women were frequently victims of crimes that went uninvestigated and unpunished. The poorest women, often older or dealing with illness, injury, or addiction to alcohol, lived in conditions of severe deprivation. They might shelter in abandoned buildings, under bridges, in stable lofts, or anywhere else they could find minimal protection from weather. These women charged minimal amounts, attracted only the poorest clients, and lived on the absolute margins of existence. Contemporary records occasionally mention these most desperate individuals, though usually only when their bodies were found or when they came to attention of authorities for other reasons. Seasonal variations affected living conditions significantly. Summer offered at least warmer weather, though heat could make cramped, poorly ventilated rooms stifling. Winter brought cold that was genuinely dangerous. Buildings that served this trade were rarely well heated, as fuel was expensive. Women might huddle together for warmth, wrap themselves in whatever clothing and blankets they could obtain, and simply endure the cold as another hardship in lives already full of difficulties. Sanitation in these living spaces was minimal by any standard. Chamber pots were emptied irregularly, washing facilities were basic at best, and the concentration of multiple people in small spaces with poor ventilation created conditions that were unsanitary and unpleasant. The smell, the lack of cleanliness, and the health implications of these conditions added to the general misery of the women's daily existence. Despite these harsh conditions, women attempted to create whatever small comforts they could. A flower in a window, a religious image on a wall, a treasured personal item kept safe. These small touches of humanity persisted even in the bleakest circumstances. Women formed friendships and support networks with others in similar situations, creating bonds that helped them endure what they couldn't escape. The typical day for a woman engaged in this work varied by season, location, and individual circumstances, but certain patterns emerged across medieval Europe. Understanding the rhythm of daily life reveals both the mundane realities and the constant challenges these women faced. The day often began late, as the nature of the work meant that most activity occurred during evening and nighttime hours. Women who had worked late into the previous night might not rise until mid-morning or even afternoon. This inverted schedule separated them further from respectable society, which conducted its business during daylight hours. Upon waking, basic needs had to be addressed. Washing, dressing, attending to personal hygiene. These activities were constrained by limited resources. Water had to be fetched if the living quarters didn't have ready access. Washing facilities were basic, and thorough bathing was infrequent given the effort and resources required. Women made do with partial washing and attempts to maintain some degree of cleanliness despite difficult circumstances. Clothing required attention. The garments women wore for their work had to be relatively presentable to attract clients, but also had to withstand constant wear. Mending tears, washing soiled items, and attempting to maintain an appearance that wouldn't actively repel clients took time and effort. Some municipal regulations specified what such women could and couldn't wear, typically prohibiting certain colours, fabrics, or styles associated with respectable women. These dress codes marked them visibly as belonging to a stigmatised category. Food was another concern requiring daily attention. Women had to eat, but their irregular schedules and often limited means meant that meals were catch-as-catch-can affairs. A woman might visit a market to buy bread, cheese, or other simple foods, or in establishments where meals were provided she might eat whatever the house operator served. The diet was rarely adequate, and malnutrition was common among women in this profession. Money management occupied considerable mental space. Earnings varied day to day. Sometimes they were relatively generous clients. Other days brought barely enough to cover basic needs. Women had to calculate carefully. How much did they owe the house operator for room and board? What did they need for food? Could they set aside anything for clothing, emergencies, or the perpetually deferred dream of saving enough to leave this life? The mathematics rarely worked in their favour. Afternoons might offer brief periods of relative freedom. Women could visit markets, attend churches, though they might face hostility or segregation even in religious spaces, or simply rest before evening work began. Some women had children, either from their work or from previous relationships, and afternoon hours offered time for childcare. These children, often cared for by other women in the community or left largely unsupervised, faced their own difficult circumstances and uncertain futures. Religious observance was complicated for women viewed as sinners by church teachings. Some women maintained private devotions, praying in their rooms or visiting churches during quiet times when they might be less noticed. Others had abandoned religious practice, feeling themselves too sinful or rejected by the church to participate. Still others went through religious motions while struggling with the contradiction between their faith and their circumstances. The psychological burden of being constantly labelled sinful, combined with genuine religious belief, created internal conflicts that many women never resolved. As evening approached, the workday began. Women in houses would prepare their rooms, ensure they had whatever supplies they needed, and wait for clients. Those working independently would go to their usual locations, particular streets, taverns, or public spaces known for this activity, and make themselves available. The act of soliciting clients varied by local custom and regulation, ranging from relatively open approaches to more subtle signals understood by those seeking such services. The actual work itself involved not just physical intimacy, but also emotional labour. Clients expected various degrees of attention, conversation, and the simulation of genuine interest or affection. Women became skilled at reading clients, providing whatever experience was desired while maintaining emotional distance for their own protection. The ability to seem engaged while remaining detached was a survival skill that many women developed. Between clients, there were periods of waiting. In houses, women might gather in common areas, talking with each other, doing small tasks like mending or simply sitting. Independent workers might spend hours in cold, uncomfortable locations hoping for clients. The uncertainty. Would there be enough clients tonight to earn adequate money? Would clients be relatively safe or dangerous? Created constant low-level anxiety. Some clients were regulars who developed ongoing relationships with particular women. These repeat clients might be preferred because they were known quantities. Their behaviour was predictable. They paid reliably, and they sometimes showed small kindnesses like bringing food or small gifts. Regular clients provided income stability that one-time encounters didn't offer. However, regulars could also become possessive or demanding, creating complications. Other clients were strangers, one-time encounters that carried greater uncertainty and risk. Strange clients had to be assessed quickly. Were they drunk and potentially violent? Did they seem diseased? Would they pay what they promised or try to cheat? Women developed intuitions about danger, but those intuitions weren't always accurate, and sometimes women couldn't afford to be picky when they desperately needed money. The end of the working evening, often well after midnight, brought its own routines. Settling accounts with house operators, securing earnings, attending to any injuries or health issues, and finally getting to sleep completed the cycle. Sleep was precious but often inadequate, as women dealt with physical discomfort, emotional distress, or simply the difficulty of sleeping in crowded, noisy conditions. The daily routine was punctuated by health concerns. Methods for preventing pregnancy were limited and unreliable. Herbal remedies, crude barrier methods, or timing-based approaches that often failed. Pregnancy was a constant risk that could interrupt work and create desperate situations. Diseases transmitted through intimacy were common, and treatments were limited. women dealt with various health problems, infections, injuries, chronic pain, with minimal medical care, usually relying on folk remedies and the advice of other women. Medieval authorities' attitudes toward this profession were complex and often contradictory. Religious condemnation coexisted with practical toleration, creating legal and social frameworks that attempted to manage what they couldn't or wouldn't eliminate. The Church officially viewed engaging in intimacy outside marriage as serious sin, and doing so for money was considered even worse. Theologians wrote extensively about the moral dangers, using these women as examples of sin and degradation in sermons and moral teachings. The terminology used to describe such women was harsh and dehumanizing, reflecting deep religious disapproval. However, even church authorities recognized that attempts to eliminate this activity had historically failed, leading some theologians to reluctantly accept it as an unfortunate social reality. The most influential religious position was articulated by St. Augustine, and later by Thomas Aquinas, who argued that tolerating this profession, while not approving of it, was necessary to prevent greater evils. The logic was that providing outlets for male desire prevented worse crimes. The logic being that men who couldn't control themselves would assault respectable women if alternatives weren't available. This argument essentially sacrificed women working in this trade for the supposed protection of other women, a deeply problematic logic that nonetheless influenced medieval policy. Civil authorities varied in their approaches depending on time, place and circumstances. Some cities attempted complete prohibition, declaring the practice illegal and imposing penalties on both the women and their clients. These prohibitions were notoriously difficult to enforce, and often led to the activity simply moving to less visible locations rather than actually stopping. Other authorities opted for regulation rather than prohibition. Municipal governments might license establishments, collect taxes, impose health inspections, and create rules governing where and how this activity could occur. Regulation generated revenue while giving authorities some control over a trade they recognised couldn't be eliminated. The women themselves were often required to register with authorities, pay taxes or fees, and comply with various restrictions. Regulated systems typically confined this activity to specific districts or streets, keeping it away from churches, schools, and respectable residential areas. Women might be required to dress distinctively, making their profession obvious to observers. Operating outside designated areas or without proper licensing could result in fines, physical penalties, or expulsion from the city. The regulations were designed to contain and control rather than support or protect. The women's welfare was rarely the primary concern. The legal status of women in this profession was precarious. They were generally considered to exist outside normal social and legal protections. Violence against them was common and rarely prosecuted. If a woman complained of assault, theft, or other crimes, authorities often dismissed her claims or even blamed her for inviting trouble through her profession. The effective denial of legal protection left these women extremely vulnerable to exploitation and harm. Citizenship and residency rights were often denied to such women. Some cities expelled them periodically, particularly during times of religious fervour or plague when they were scapegoated as sources of God's displeasure or disease. These expulsions were rarely permanent. Economic realities meant the women usually returned or were eventually allowed back, but they created instability and reinforced the women's marginal social status. Clients faced far fewer legal consequences than the women. While some regulations technically penalised both parties, enforcement was dramatically unequal. A respectable man visiting such women might face social disapproval if publicly exposed, but rarely face legal consequences. Married men might face ecclesiastical penalties if their activities became known to church authorities, but again, enforcement was inconsistent. The double standard was obvious and accepted. Men's behaviour was implicitly tolerated while women bore the blame and consequences. Some cities developed complex bureaucratic systems around regulation. Officials might be appointed to oversee establishments, collect taxes, mediate disputes, and enforce compliance with rules. In a few cases, municipal governments actually operated their own establishments, running them as public enterprises that generated revenue. This direct government involvement in the trade created uncomfortable situations where authorities both condemned and profited from an activity they officially viewed as immoral. Periodic reform movements attempted to shut down this trade, often motivated by religious zeal or moral panic. Preachers would campaign for closure of establishments, and authorities would respond with crackdowns, arrests, and expulsions. These campaigns rarely lasted long. Economic interests, practical recognition of demand, and the return of more tolerant policies would eventually restore the previous status quo. However, during crackdowns, the women faced genuine hardship, losing income and housing while being blamed for society's moral failures. The legal framework also intersected with slavery and trafficking. Some women were held in debt bondage, technically free but practically enslaved by debts they could never repay. Others were explicitly bought and sold, though this was generally illegal. Trafficking of girls and young women occurred, though documentation is limited. Legal authorities sometimes prosecuted the most egregious trafficking cases, but often looked the other way, particularly when powerful individuals were involved. The health challenges facing women in this profession were numerous and severe. The combination of inadequate nutrition, poor living conditions, exposure to disease, and the physical nature of the work itself created a range of health problems that medieval medicine was poorly equipped to address. Diseases transmitted through intimate contact were endemic. Medieval people didn't understand the bacterial and viral causes of these infections, but they recognized that certain illnesses spread through intimate activity. Women knew they risked contracting diseases from clients, but had limited means to protect themselves. The methods available, douching with wine or vinegar, herbal preparations, inspection of clients for visible signs of disease, offered minimal protection at best. Once infected, treatment options were limited and often ineffective. Medical practitioners had some treatments, mercury compounds, herbal preparations, cauterization, that were sometimes used to treat symptoms, but these treatments were expensive, often as harmful as the diseases they treated, and ultimately couldn't cure infections that required antibiotics that wouldn't exist for centuries. The progression of untreated infections could be devastating. Women suffered chronic pain, disfigurement, and eventual organ damage. Some diseases caused visible sores or lesions, which further stigmatized already marginalized women and made continuing to work increasingly difficult. The final stages of some infections were truly terrible, and medieval records occasionally mention women dying in horrible circumstances from diseases contracted through their work. Pregnancy was another constant health concern. The limited and unreliable methods available for preventing pregnancy meant that women frequently became pregnant despite their best efforts. Pregnancy interrupted work. Clients were rarely interested in visibly pregnant women, creating economic crisis for women who depended on daily earnings. Some women continued working as long as possible, risking their health and that of their unborn children. When pregnancies occurred, outcomes varied. Some women carried to term and gave birth, facing the question of what to do with children they could barely support. Infanticide, while officially illegal and considered serious crime, probably occurred with some frequency, though documentation is understandably sparse. Abandonment was more common, with infants left at churches, convents, or charitable institutions that might provide care. Some women managed to keep and raise their children despite the difficulties, creating family situations that were precarious and stigmatized. Others sought to end pregnancies, using herbal preparations that were believed to cause miscarriage. These abortifacients were dangerous, often ineffective, and could cause serious harm or death to the woman. The plants and preparations used, pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and various other herbs, were poisonous, and the doses needed to potentially affect pregnancy were high enough to risk poisoning the woman. Some women died from attempted abortions and others suffered permanent damage. Physical injuries were common. Violence from clients, accidents during transactions in awkward locations, and the cumulative strain of the work itself all took tolls on women's bodies. Broken bones, bruises, cuts, and more serious injuries occurred regularly. Medical care was expensive and often unavailable, so women dealt with injuries through folk remedies and mutual aid, learning to set bones, stitch wounds, and treat various traumas as best they could without professional help. Chronic pain became normal for many women. Joint problems, back pain, pelvic pain, headaches, all resulting from the physical demands and frequent injuries. Living with constant discomfort was simply accepted as part of life, as medieval medicine had little to offer for chronic pain management beyond alcohol and a few herbal preparations. Malnutrition undermined health in numerous ways. Women who couldn't afford adequate food faced deficiency diseases, weakened immune systems, and reduced healing capacity. The visible signs of malnutrition, thin bodies, poor skin, missing or bad teeth, brittle hair, also affected women's ability to attract clients, creating a vicious cycle where poor health reduced earning potential, which further worsened nutrition and health. Mental health struggles were probably common, though medieval people didn't conceptualize psychological distress in modern terms. Depression, anxiety, and trauma symptoms likely affected many women dealing with the accumulation of difficult experiences, social stigma, and lack of hope for better futures. Alcohol was often used to cope, creating addiction problems that further complicated already difficult lives. The cycle of using alcohol to numb pain, then needing money for more alcohol, trapped some women in situations they couldn't escape. Life expectancy for women in this profession was almost certainly shorter than for women in other circumstances, though precise statistics don't exist. The combination of disease, violence, poor nutrition, dangerous pregnancies, lack of medical care, and general hardship meant that many women didn't live to old age. Those who did survive often faced destitution in later years, unable to work and with no savings or family support to fall back on. Despite the difficult circumstances and social stigma, women in this profession formed relationships and human connections that provided crucial emotional support and helped them survive day to day. These bonds reveal the humanity that persisted even in the most challenging situations. Friendships between women working in the same houses or areas were vitally important. These weren't always harmonious. Women competed for clients, argued over money, and dealt with the friction that close quarters and shared hardship create. However, many also formed genuine friendships, supporting each other through illness, sharing resources during hard times, and providing emotional support that no one else would offer. These friendships were based on shared understanding. Only someone living the same life could truly understand what they faced. Older women sometimes took younger ones under their wings, teaching them how to navigate the dangers, advising on health matters, and providing the guidance that mothers or older sisters might offer in other circumstances. This mentorship helped younger women survive initial periods when everything was new and frightening. The older women gained companionship and perhaps a sense of purpose in helping others avoid the worst mistakes they had made. Some women formed romantic relationships with each other, finding intimacy and affection in partnerships that existed outside their work. These relationships weren't necessarily sexual, though some certainly were, but rather offered emotional intimacy and mutual support that their work connections didn't provide. In a world that dehumanized and objectified them, finding someone who saw them as full human beings was precious beyond measure. Relationships with clients were complex and varied. Most transactions were purely commercial, brief encounters with strangers who had no interest in the women as people. However, some clients became regulars who developed ongoing relationships with particular women. These regular clients might bring gifts, show small kindnesses, and treat the women with something approaching respect. While still commercial relationships at their core, they offered glimmers of humanity in otherwise dehumanizing work. Some clients fell in love with the women they visited, and occasionally these affections were returned. Historical records contain examples of men marrying women from this profession, helping them leave that life and establishing conventional households. These successful transitions were probably rare, and many attempted relationships failed due to social pressures, the woman's inability to escape her past reputation, or the man's family opposition. But the possibility of such relationships offered hope, however slim. Children represented another type of relationship that complicated these women's lives. Mothers in this profession faced immense challenges: how to care for children while working, how to protect them from the harsh realities of their mothers' lives, how to provide adequate food and shelter with limited resources. Some women found caregivers, other women in similar circumstances who cared for multiple children while their mothers worked, creating informal childcare networks. The children of such women faced their own hardships. They grew up stigmatized by their mothers' professions, struggled with poverty, and had uncertain futures. Daughters sometimes followed their mothers into the same work, continuing cycles that seemed almost impossible to break. Sons faced different but also difficult prospects, growing up with the knowledge of their mother's work and the social stigma that attached to them. Some women maintained connections with their birth families, though these relationships were often strained or severed. families that had rejected daughters who entered this profession sometimes relented later, particularly if the woman achieved some success, or if family circumstances changed. Other families maintained complete separation, treating their daughter or sister as though she had died. The pain of these broken family bonds added to the emotional burden these women carried. Religious relationships were complicated but important to many. Despite official church condemnation and the treatment they received from some religious authorities, many women maintained faith and sought spiritual comfort. Some priests and religious figures showed compassion, providing counsel, hearing confessions, and treating these women as souls deserving of mercy rather than as irredeemable sinners. These understanding clergy members offered crucial support to women who needed both spiritual and practical assistance. Charitable workers, particularly women from religious communities dedicated to helping the poor and marginalised, sometimes reached out to women in this profession. These outreach efforts aim to encourage women to leave that life, offering alternatives like sheltered work environments or opportunities to enter religious life themselves. While these efforts had mixed success, many women returned to their previous work when alternatives proved inadequate. They demonstrated that not everyone viewed these women as beyond redemption or help. The relationships between women in this profession and respectable society were minimal but occasionally existed. Laundresses, market vendors, landlords, and others who provided services to these women maintained business relationships that could sometimes evolve into something approaching human connection. A sympathetic landlady might show small kindnesses, a vendor might extend credit during hard times, or a healer might provide medical care with compassion rather than judgment. Understanding how women entered this profession and whether they could leave provides crucial context for appreciating their circumstances. The pathways in were numerous, the pathways out far fewer. Economic desperation drove many women into this work, as discussed earlier. A widow with children to feed and no means of support, a girl orphaned with no family willing to take her in, a woman abandoned by her husband with no skills to support herself. These situations created genuine desperation that led to terrible choices. The decision to enter this work wasn't made lightly, but when the alternative was starvation, it could seem like the only option. Coercion and trafficking brought some women into this life against their will. Young girls might be sold by desperate parents, abducted by traffickers, or tricked with promises of legitimate work in distant cities, only to find themselves trapped in houses they couldn't escape. While the extent of trafficking in medieval Europe is difficult to determine from limited records, it certainly occurred, and women trapped in such situations faced enormous difficulties escaping. Some women were born into this life, daughters of women in the profession who had few other options. Growing up in houses, knowing no other life, these young women might enter the same work as teenagers or young adults, continuing family patterns across generations. This intergenerational transmission of marginalization created cycles that were extremely difficult to break. Failed relationships led some women to this profession. A woman abandoned by a lover, particularly if she was pregnant or had a child, faced ruined reputation and limited options. In a society that harshly judged women for intimate activity outside marriage, a single misstep could destroy respectability permanently. Once a woman's reputation was lost, finding legitimate work became nearly impossible, and this profession might be the only way to survive. Violence and abuse drove some women to run away from impossible domestic situations. A girl fleeing an abusive father or a wife escaping a violent husband might find herself alone in a strange town with no resources and no one to turn to. In such circumstances, this work might seem like the only option for immediate survival, though it trapped them in different but still exploitative situations. Once in this life, leaving was extraordinarily difficult. The social stigma was nearly impossible to overcome. A woman known to have worked in this profession couldn't easily return to respectable society. Potential employers wouldn't hire her, respectable men wouldn't marry her, and communities that knew her history wouldn't accept her. The mark of this work seemed indelible, following women throughout their lives. Economic barriers also prevented escape. Women who worked for house operators often accumulated debts that they could never fully repay. Those working independently struggled to save money when daily survival consumed all their earnings. The goal of saving enough to establish a small business, purchase training in a legitimate trade, or otherwise create alternative livelihoods remained perpetually just out of reach for most women. Some did manage to leave. Marriage offered one escape route, though finding husbands willing to overlook their past was challenging. Older men, widowers with children needing stepmothers, foreigners unfamiliar with the women's histories, or men from lower social classes willing to accept women others rejected. These might offer marriage opportunities that allowed women to transition to more conventional lives. Religious institutions provided another exit path. Some convents accepted women from this background who wanted to enter religious life, though many religious houses refused such women. The penitent Magdalene tradition, based on the biblical Mary Magdalene, recognized the possibility of redemption and encouraged such women to embrace religious life as atonement for previous sins. However, women entering religious life from such backgrounds often faced inferior status within convents, relegated to doing the hardest work and never fully accepted by women from respectable backgrounds. Charitable institutions established specifically to help women leave this profession emerged in some medieval cities. These Magdalene houses or similar organisations offered shelter, training in legitimate trades, and support for women attempting to transition to respectable lives. However, these institutions were limited in number and capacity, helping only a small fraction of women who sought to leave the trade. They also often imposed strict religious discipline and moral supervision that some women found as controlling as their previous circumstances. Some women simply aged out of the work. As they grew older, lost whatever physical attractiveness had attracted clients, and found themselves unable to earn adequate money, they had to find alternatives. Some became house operators, using their experience and whatever money they'd managed to save to employ younger women. Others found marginal legitimate work, laundry, cleaning, other low-paid labour that didn't require pristine reputations. The fortunate few who had saved money might establish small businesses, though this required both significant savings and communities willing to do business with women of questionable backgrounds. The unluckiest women simply descended into deeper poverty and destitution. Unable to work, unable to save, without family support, they became beggars or died in charity hospitals if such facilities existed. Their final years were often marked by extreme poverty, illness, and social isolation. Contemporary records occasionally mention such women dying alone and unmourned, their bodies buried in unmarked graves that reflected their marginal status. Behind the economic transactions, legal frameworks, and social structures was a profound human cost that statistics and regulations can't fully capture. Understanding this cost means acknowledging the individual suffering, lost potential, and accumulated trauma that characterised these women's lives. The psychological toll of this work was immense, though medieval people didn't have modern frameworks for understanding mental health. Living with constant stigma, being treated as less than fully human, enduring regular sexual contact that was rarely desired and often unpleasant or frightening. All of this took profound tolls on women's sense of self and well-being. Many probably experienced what we'd now recognise as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, though they had no terms for these conditions and no treatments available. The loss of dignity and autonomy was perhaps the most devastating aspect. These women had minimal control over their bodies, their time, or their futures. They were subject to demands from clients, controlled by house operators, stigmatised by society, and condemned by religious authorities. The accumulation of experiences where they were treated as objects rather than people damaged their sense of humanity and self-worth in ways that were difficult to overcome. Violence was a constant threat that created pervasive fear. Women faced assault from clients, attacks from strangers, and abuse from those who operated houses. They had no real recourse when harmed. Authorities rarely investigated crimes against such women, and the women themselves were often blamed for provoking whatever happened to them. Living with this constant vulnerability created anxiety and hypervigilance that took tremendous emotional energy. The physical toll accumulated over years. Chronic health problems, untreated injuries, malnutrition, and the effects of repeated pregnancies and diseases wore bodies down prematurely. Women who might have lived to old age in better circumstances often didn't survive middle age. Those who did survive often faced their later years with damaged health and chronic pain. The social isolation was crushing. Separated from respectable society, denied normal social relationships, treated as pariahs by most people they encountered. This isolation left women without the social support networks that make life bearable. The friendships they formed with others in similar circumstances provided some support, but couldn't fully replace the broader social connections that most humans need. Lost potential represented another profound cost. Many of these women were intelligent, capable individuals who might have thrived in different circumstances. They might have been skilled artisans, successful merchants, devoted mothers raising children in stable homes, or contributors to their communities in countless ways. Instead, their potential was crushed by poverty, limited options and social structures that offered them no better paths. The intergenerational impacts were also significant. Children growing up in these circumstances faced enormous disadvantages. They dealt with poverty, social stigma, disrupted educations, such as they were in medieval times, and uncertain futures. Some repeated their parents' patterns, perpetuating cycles of marginalization across generations. Breaking these cycles required resources and opportunities that were rarely available. The emotional numbness that many women probably developed as a coping mechanism was itself a tragedy. To endure their daily realities, women might have learned to disconnect emotionally, to stop feeling, to treat their own lives and bodies as objects. This protective numbness allowed them to function, but at the cost of their emotional vitality and capacity for joy. Learning to not care, to not feel, to not hope. These survival strategies were adaptations to unbearable circumstances that extracted profound costs. The lost relationships, with families who rejected them, with children they couldn't properly care for, with men who might have loved them but couldn't overcome social barriers to be with them, created ongoing grief. Each broken relationship added to the accumulation of loss that these women carried. Yet despite all of this, many women retained their humanity, dignity, and capacity for kindness. Historical records contain examples of women in this profession helping others, showing generosity toward those even worse off than themselves, maintaining religious faith despite being condemned by religious institutions, and finding moments of joy and connection despite overwhelming hardship. This resilience wasn't inevitable or universal, and we shouldn't romanticize survival in terrible circumstances, but it's important to recognize that these were full human beings with inner lives, emotions, and spirits that persisted despite everything. Looking back across the centuries at these women's lives requires balancing several important considerations: historical accuracy, empathy, critical analysis of the social structures that created their circumstances, and recognition of how dramatically society has evolved since medieval times. Medieval sources provide limited and often problematic information about these women. The historical record was written almost entirely by men, clergy, legal officials, and writers, who viewed such women through lenses of moral condemnation. The women themselves rarely left written records of their experiences, so we see them through the judgmental eyes of those who condemned them, rather than hearing their own voices. This means that much of what we know about their lives comes from sources that dehumanize them. Court records, municipal regulations, moral treatises, and similar documents mention these women in passing, usually in context of prosecution, regulation, or condemnation. Occasionally, records contain more detailed information: witness testimony in criminal cases, petitions for assistance, records of women entering religious houses that provide glimpses of individual women's experiences. But these sources are scattered, incomplete, and always filtered through contemporary prejudices. Modern historians studying this topic face challenges in reconstructing these women's lives, while avoiding both sensationalism and excessive sanitization. The goal is to understand their experiences honestly while maintaining respect for them as human beings who deserve dignity even in historical accounts. This means acknowledging the difficult realities, the exploitation, the health risks, the violence, while also recognizing their agency, resilience, and humanity. Comparing medieval circumstances to modern situations reveals both continuities and dramatic changes. The economic desperation that drove women into this work persists in many parts of the world today, though usually in different forms. Trafficking and coercion continue to be serious problems. The stigma attached to such work, while perhaps less absolute than in medieval times, still marks women and limits their options. Violence and health risks remain concerns. However, enormous changes have occurred. modern medicine can prevent and treat diseases that were death sentences in medieval times. Contraception allows women to avoid unwanted pregnancies far more effectively. Legal frameworks in most developed countries now recognise such women's rights and attempt to provide protections, though implementation is often inadequate. Social safety nets, when they exist, provide alternatives to the desperate choices that medieval women faced. Education and employment opportunities have expanded dramatically for women, creating options that simply didn't exist in medieval society. The medieval church's position, official condemnation combined with pragmatic acceptance, seems deeply hypocritical from modern perspectives. Religious authorities condemned these women as sinners, while simultaneously accepting their activity as a necessary social evil. This approach sacrificed women on the margins to supposedly protect respectable women, a logic that blamed victims rather than addressing the social structures, male behaviour, and economic inequalities that created the entire system. Modern religious communities have increasingly recognised these past failures and attempted to develop more compassionate approaches. Medieval civil authorities' responses, oscillating between prohibition and regulation, profiting from taxation while stigmatising the women, denying legal protections while demanding compliance with regulations, also seem deeply unjust. The double standards that punished women while excusing male clients reflected broader gender inequalities that pervaded medieval society. Modern understanding recognises that any system built on such inequalities is fundamentally unjust, though societies still struggle to create truly fair approaches. Studying medieval situations also illuminates ongoing debates about modern policy, arguments about prohibition versus legalisation, about protecting women versus individual autonomy, about addressing demand versus managing supply. All of these modern debates have historical precedents. Medieval societies tried various approaches and none solved the underlying problems completely. This historical perspective doesn't provide easy answers to modern questions, but it does suggest that simple solutions are unlikely, and that any approach must centre the well-being and humanity of the women involved. And so, as we step back from the difficult lives we've explored, several truths emerge with clarity. First, these were real people. Daughters, mothers, friends, human beings with thoughts, feelings, hopes, and fears, who happened to live in circumstances that offered them few good choices. They deserve to be remembered with dignity and their stories told with honesty and respect. Second, their circumstances were created largely by social structures, economic inequalities, and limited opportunities rather than by their own moral failures. Medieval society created situations where some women faced genuinely impossible choices, then blamed those women for the choices they made. This victim blaming obscured the real problems: poverty, lack of opportunities for women, double standards in sexual morality, and acceptance of male behaviour that created the demand while condemning those who met it. Third, despite facing circumstances that would break many people, these women showed remarkable resilience, resourcefulness, and humanity. They formed relationships, supported each other, cared for their children as best they could, and maintained their sense of self despite everything that attempted to dehumanize them. This resilience shouldn't be romanticized. They shouldn't have had to be resilient in the face of such circumstances, but it does deserve recognition and respect. Fourth, the historical record has been profoundly unfair to these women. Written by those who condemned them, the sources we have often reduced them to stereotypes or statistics, rather than recognizing them as individuals. Recovering their full humanity from fragmentary, judgmental sources is challenging, but making the attempt matters because these were real people whose experiences are part of human history. Fifth, while society has progressed significantly since medieval times, many of the underlying issues persist. Economic desperation still drives people into exploitative situations. Stigma still marks those involved in such work. Violence and health risks remain concerns. The medieval past serves as a reminder that these problems are neither new nor easily solved, though modern societies have tools and understanding that medieval people lacked. Understanding medieval experiences can foster empathy for people in difficult circumstances today. When we recognise that medieval women entered this work primarily because of poverty and lack of alternatives rather than moral deficiency, we can extend that understanding to modern situations. People throughout history have made difficult choices in impossible circumstances, and judgment rarely helps while compassion and structural change might. The story of medieval women in this profession is ultimately a story about humanity, inequality, resilience, and the ongoing struggle to create societies that offer all people genuine choices and dignity. These women lived and died centuries ago, their individual names mostly lost to history, their specific experiences unrecorded. But they were here. They lived, they struggled, they endured, and they deserve to be remembered not as symbols of sin or abstract historical curiosities, but as human beings who faced extraordinary challenges with whatever resources they could muster. Their lives stand as testament to the human capacity to survive in the face of overwhelming hardship, but also as an indictment of social structures that created such hardship in the first place. We honour them not by sanitizing their experiences or ignoring the difficulties they faced, but by acknowledging the full truth of their lives while recognizing their fundamental humanity. In their stories, difficult as they are to confront, we find reminders of our shared human vulnerability and the ongoing importance of building societies that offer genuine opportunity, protection, and dignity to all people, especially those most vulnerable to exploitation and harm. The experiences of women in this profession varied dramatically, depending on whether they worked in large cities, small towns, or rural areas. Understanding these geographical differences reveals how location shaped every aspect of their lives and the challenges they faced. Large cities, London, Paris, Venice, Florence, Barcelona, offered both the greatest opportunities and the greatest dangers. Urban populations included substantial numbers of unmarried men, merchants, labourers, soldiers, apprentices, students, and travellers. This demographic created consistent demand that could support relatively large numbers of women in this trade. Cities also offered a degree of anonymity impossible in smaller communities, allowing women to work with somewhat less immediate scrutiny from neighbours who knew their entire histories. Urban areas typically had designated districts where this activity was tolerated or officially regulated. These red light districts, though that modern term didn't exist, were well known to residents and visitors alike. Women working in these areas benefited from the concentration of potential clients, the presence of other women providing safety in numbers, and the semi-official status that regulation provided. However, they also faced competition from numerous other women, pressure from house operators who controlled the most profitable locations, and the constant surveillance of municipal authorities who taxed and regulated their activities. The houses in urban areas range from relatively well-maintained establishments, catering to wealthier clients, to squalid buildings where the poorest women worked in terrible conditions. The better establishments might have multiple rooms, basic furnishings, and some security provisions. These houses served merchants, prosperous artisans, and occasionally even nobles who visited incognito. Women working in such houses could earn relatively good money, though house operators took substantial portions of their earnings. Mid-range establishments served ordinary working men, labourers, soldiers, apprentices, who had some money to spend but weren't wealthy. These houses were more basic, with minimal furnishings and less security. Women working here earned moderate amounts but faced greater risks from clients who might be drunk, violent, or unable to pay. The atmosphere in these establishments could be rowdy and dangerous, particularly on paydays or during festivals when large numbers of men had money and were looking for entertainment. The lowest-tier urban establishments were barely better than the streets. Housed in decrepit buildings in the poorest neighbourhoods, these places offered no security, no comfort, and minimal earnings. Women working here served the poorest clients, charged minimal amounts, and lived in conditions of genuine squalor. These were often older women, those dealing with illness or injury, or women who had descended into alcohol dependency and could no longer attract better clients. Street work in cities was common, particularly among women who couldn't afford to work in houses, or who had been expelled from establishments for various reasons. These independent workers solicited clients on streets known for such activity, in taverns, near markets, or in other public spaces. They had to be alert for city guards who might arrest them for violating ordinances, criminals who might rob or assault them, and the general dangers of working alone in urban environments. Urban women also had access to more resources than their rural counterparts. Cities had hospitals, charitable institutions, religious organisations, and informal support networks, that might provide assistance during crises. Markets offered food variety that rural areas lacked. The presence of other women in similar circumstances created communities of mutual support. However, cities also had more authorities monitoring and regulating the trade, more competition for clients, and higher costs of living that consumed earnings quickly. Smaller towns presented different circumstances. With populations perhaps numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, towns couldn't support large numbers of women in this profession. Those who did work in small towns were highly visible to their communities. Everyone knew who they were, where they lived, and what they did. This visibility created constant social pressure and stigma, while also providing a certain grudging acceptance. Townspeople might condemn such women morally while pragmatically accepting their presence. Town authorities in smaller communities often attempted more direct control than was possible in large cities. Local officials might personally know the women, monitor their activities closely, and respond quickly to complaints from respectable citizens. The women had less ability to operate independently or avoid official notice. However, smaller towns also sometimes showed more flexibility, with authorities willing to look the other way as long as women were discreet and didn't create obvious disturbances. Women in small towns often combined this work with other activities. A woman might work as a laundress or alewife as her primary occupation, accepting payment for intimacy from particular clients as a supplement to legitimate earnings. This blurred the lines between respectable poverty and outright participation in the trade, creating grey areas that both women and authorities often found convenient. Rural areas presented yet another set of circumstances. True countryside had too few people and too little cash economy to support women in this profession full-time. However, rural women facing desperate circumstances might engage in this activity occasionally, particularly during harvest seasons when transient workers arrived with money to spend, or near pilgrimage routes where travellers passed through regularly. Taverns along major roads sometimes served as meeting places where women and travellers negotiated transactions. Innkeepers' wives or daughters might supplement household income this way, or women might travel between taverns serving different clienteles. The seasonal nature of rural work, intense during harvests, slow during winters, created patterns where women might work in this trade during busy seasons and return to regular labour at other times. Rural women faced extreme isolation and vulnerability. Without the urban concentrations of women providing mutual support, without city institutions offering assistance, rural women working alone faced enormous risks. Violence, non-payment, and lack of recourse when harmed were even more pronounced in rural settings than in cities. The social stigma was also more intense in small communities, where everyone knew everyone else's business and reputations were everything. Military camps represented a specific type of setting that attracted women throughout medieval Europe. Armies on campaign needed various services: laundry, cooking, nursing, and women followed armies providing these services. Some also engaged in intimate transactions with soldiers who had just been paid or who had looted valuables. These camp followers lived in dangerous, unstable circumstances, moving with armies, exposed to battle risks, disease outbreaks, and the particular dangers that accompanied large groups of armed men far from home and normal social constraints. Port cities had their own dynamics. Sailors arriving after months at sea with pay to spend created surge demand. Women in port cities might earn substantial money when ships arrived, but face lean times when no vessels were in port. The transient nature of port city clientele, sailors who would leave soon and likely never return, meant less risk of regular clients becoming possessive, but also less opportunity to build relationships with clients who might show kindness or reliability. University towns attracted women to serve student populations. Young men away from home, often with spending money from families, created markets for various services including intimate companionship. Towns like Oxford, Cambridge, Paris and Bologna had populations of women serving student clients. However, university authorities and town officials often cracked down on such activity, viewing it as corrupting influences on students, leading to periodic arrests, expulsions and crackdowns that made this work particularly unstable. Pilgrimage centres saw seasonal influxes of pilgrims travelling to holy sites. Women might work near major pilgrimage destinations, serving travellers who had brought money for their journeys. The irony of engaging in activities considered sinful in places dedicated to spiritual devotion wasn't lost on contemporaries. and religious authorities at pilgrimage sites often attempted to suppress such activity, though with limited success given the economic realities. The geography of this profession thus created vastly different experiences. A woman working in a regulated establishment in Venice faced different challenges than one working streets in London, different again from one in a small German town, and completely different from a rural woman in the French countryside accepting occasional payments to supplement farming income. Location shaped everything: earning potential, risks faced, degree of regulation, available support systems, and possibilities for leaving the trade. Medieval life followed seasonal rhythms, and this profession was no exception. The changing seasons brought different challenges, opportunities, and experiences that shaped women's daily realities throughout the year. Spring brought renewal to medieval society and temporary improvements to women's circumstances. As weather warmed, the immediate physical discomfort of winter cold receded. Longer days meant more potential working hours and more activity in towns and cities. Markets became busier, travelling merchants arrived, and economic activity increased, putting more money in circulation. Men who had been relatively homebound during winter ventured out more, increasing potential clientele. However, spring also brought challenges. Easter and the Lenten season preceding it were times of religious intensity when authorities and religious leaders often campaigned against moral laxity. Crackdowns on this profession sometimes accompanied religious festivals, with women facing arrests, fines, or temporary expulsions designed to demonstrate religious zeal and moral rectitude. Women learned to be more discreet during these periods, knowing that the post-Lenten return to normal would eventually come. Spring agricultural work created labour demand in rural areas, offering alternative employment for women who moved between this profession and seasonal agricultural labour. Planting season, while exhausting, offered a respectable way to earn money. Some women worked in fields during days and returned to their other work in the evenings, maximising income by combining multiple activities. The return of travelling merchants, pilgrims, and other wayfarers as roads became passable after winter, created opportunities. Women in towns along major routes saw increased business. However, this also meant more competition as women from surrounding areas migrated to take advantage of seasonal opportunities, creating gluts that drove down prices and created conflicts between resident women and newcomers. Summer brought heat that made urban living particularly uncomfortable. The crowded, poorly ventilated rooms where women worked became stifling in warm weather. The smell, always present in medieval urban environments, intensified as organic waste and human habitation baked in summer heat. Working conditions became genuinely unpleasant, with sweat, odours, and heat making everything more difficult. Disease risks increased dramatically in summer. Plague and other epidemic diseases often peaked in warm weather. When outbreaks occurred, women in this profession faced particular danger due to their numerous intimate contacts. They also faced blame. Authorities and populace often scapegoated such women during plague outbreaks, viewing the disease as divine punishment for society's moral failings. Some cities expelled these women during epidemics, blaming them for God's wrath even as the true causes, which medieval people didn't understand, had nothing to do with moral behaviour. Summer did offer some advantages. Harvest season brought money into circulation as agricultural products were sold. Wealthy farmers, successful merchants trading in agricultural goods, and others benefiting from harvest had money to spend. Some women travelled to rural areas during harvest times, knowing that harvest workers who had just been paid might seek their services. The seasonal migration of women following economic opportunities created networks and patterns that repeated annually. Festival seasons punctuated the summer calendar. Religious feast days, Saints' Day celebrations, and local festivals brought crowds, visitors, and economic activity. Women could earn substantial money during festivals as men in celebratory mood spent more freely. However, festivals also meant more drunkenness, rowdier behaviour, and increased risks of violence. The crowds that created opportunities also created dangers. Autumn brought harvest abundance followed by the growing knowledge that winter approached. The harvest period itself was economically beneficial. Money circulated, food was plentiful, and there was a general sense of relief after successful harvests. Women ate better during harvest season, perhaps the only time many years when nutrition was adequate. Markets overflowed with fresh food that even poor women could occasionally afford. However, Autumn also brought awareness of approaching winter hardship. Women who had managed to save any money during productive summer months tried to prepare, acquiring warmer clothing, setting aside food, paying debts to ensure landlords wouldn't evict them during winter. The psychological burden of knowing winter approached added stress to lives already full of difficulties. The shortening days meant fewer working hours and less foot traffic in urban areas. As darkness came earlier, streets became more dangerous and clients scarcer. The transition from summer's relative plenty to autumn's anticipation of hardship created anxious periods when women rushed to maximise earnings while they still could. Winter was the cruelest season. The cold itself was dangerous. Poorly heated rooms, inadequate clothing, and malnutrition made women vulnerable to hypothermia, frostbite, and cold-related illnesses. The respiratory infections that circulated in winter struck hard at malnourished women living in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Many women fell ill during winter, unable to work, without savings to fall back on, facing genuine risk of perishing from cold or disease. Economic activity slowed dramatically in winter. Fewer travellers ventured out, markets were smaller, and men with limited resources prioritised basics like food and fuel over other expenditures. The clientele willing to venture out in cold weather to seek such services was reduced. Women faced periods of days or even weeks with minimal income, surviving on whatever they had saved, begging, borrowing, or simply going hungry. The physical discomfort of working in winter was extreme. Rooms were cold, clients were cold, and the act of removing clothing even briefly exposed women to dangerous cold. Frostbite was a genuine risk for women working in inadequately heated spaces. Some women burned whatever fuel they could obtain or afford, but fuel was expensive and many simply endured the cold because they had no alternative. The winter darkness was psychologically oppressive. Long nights with brief days combined with cold, hunger and social isolation created conditions conducive to deep depression. Women facing months of hardship with little hope of improvement struggled with despair. Alcohol consumption often increased as women sought to numb both physical cold and emotional pain, creating additional problems as scarce resources went to drinking rather than food or shelter. Some women left cities during winter if they could, returning to rural areas where they might find shelter with families or former communities willing to take them in during the season when their trade couldn't sustain them. Others sought refuge in charitable institutions, hospitals or religious houses that provided shelter to the desperate during winter months. However, these resources were limited and often came with requirements: participation in religious services, moral lectures, or other conditions that extracted humiliation as the price of survival. The seasonal cycle meant that women's lives consisted of periods of relative plenty, alternating with desperate want. Summer and harvest seasons offered opportunities to earn and eat adequately. Winter brought privation, cold, and genuine danger. This boom and bust cycle prevented accumulation of savings or stability, keeping women trapped in constantly recurring patterns of struggle. Understanding these seasonal variations reveals how medieval life's fundamental rhythms, shaped by agricultural calendars, weather patterns, and religious festivals, structured even the lives of society's most marginalised members. Women in this profession weren't exempt from seasonal variations that affected everyone, but they experienced these cycles without the support systems and resources that helped others survive winter's hardships. Major disruptions to medieval society, wars, plagues, famines, profoundly affected women in this profession, usually making difficult lives even worse. Understanding how these catastrophic events impacted such women reveals both their vulnerability and their resilience. Warfare created complex situations. Armies on campaign needed various services, and women followed military forces providing laundry, nursing, cooking, and intimate companionship. These camp followers lived dangerous lives, exposed to battle, disease, and the particular risks of large groups of armed men far from normal social constraints. Women might be killed in fighting, die from epidemic diseases that ravaged military camps, or face violence from soldiers who viewed such women as having no rights worth respecting. However, military campaigns also created economic opportunities. Soldiers with pay and looted valuables had money to spend. Women following armies might earn more than they could in stable urban settings, despite the greater risks. The calculation was brutally simple. endure greater danger for greater potential earnings, or stay in cities where safety was marginally better, but poverty was certain. Armies moving through regions disrupted local economies and social structures. Fighting destroyed crops, displaced populations, and killed working-age men, creating economic chaos. Women who had survived through marginal legitimate work found themselves even more desperate as economic opportunities vanished. Some turned to this profession as a desperate measure when war destroyed whatever precarious stability they had achieved. Sieges created particularly terrible situations. Cities under siege faced starvation, disease, and eventually either conquest or relief. Women in besieged cities struggled to survive along with everyone else, but faced additional challenges as social order broke down. Food became scarce, trade stopped, and men focused on survival and defence rather than seeking entertainment. The women's income vanished while their need for food remained. Some starved during prolonged sieges, dying alongside other residents. Conquered cities faced sacking, looting, violence, and chaos as victorious soldiers took what they wanted. Women in this profession were particularly vulnerable during sacks. Already viewed as having questionable status, lacking family protection, and living in marginal circumstances, they were easy targets for violence. Contemporary accounts of city sackings occasionally mention the particular vulnerability of such women, though often in judgmental terms suggesting they deserved whatever happened. Plague, whether the Black Death of the 14th century or subsequent outbreaks, devastated medieval populations and created catastrophic situations for women in this profession. The disease itself struck everyone regardless of status, but women whose work involved intimate contact with numerous people faced elevated exposure. Plague could kill half or more of urban populations during major outbreaks, and women in this profession died along with everyone else, their bodies piling up in mass graves alongside the respectable dead. The social disruption that plague created was profound. When death struck randomly and frequently, normal social structures broke down. Some women found opportunities in the chaos. With so many dead, labour shortages created opportunities for better wages in legitimate work. Women who survived might leave their previous profession to take positions as servants, agricultural workers, or in trades that had lost workers to plague, finding opportunities that hadn't existed before the epidemic. However, plague also triggered scapegoating. Religious authorities and populace sought explanations for divine wrath, and moral failings were blamed. Women in this profession faced particular scapegoating during plague years, accused of contributing to society's sinfulness that had provoked God's punishment. Some cities expelled such women during plague outbreaks, literally driving them out to die outside city walls. These expulsions did nothing to stop plague, which spread through flea bites from infected rats, though medieval people didn't know this, but satisfied the psychological need to blame and punish someone for the incomprehensible catastrophe. The economic disruption from plague was long-lasting. Markets collapsed, trade stopped, and money circulation decreased as economic activity halted. Women depending on cash transactions for survival faced situations where potential clients were either dead, dying, or had no money to spend. The survivors faced months or years of economic chaos before normal patterns resumed. Famines created desperation that drove more women into this profession, while simultaneously reducing demand. When food became scarce and prices soared, women facing starvation turned to any available means of survival. However, the same conditions that created desperation also meant that potential clients had no money for anything beyond basic food, reducing demand. The result was more women competing for fewer clients, driving down prices and creating situations where earnings were inadequate even for those working. Some women died during famines, either from outright starvation or from malnutrition that made them vulnerable to disease. Others survived through combinations of this work, begging, charity, and eating whatever they could obtain. Famine's end brought relief but often left survivors weakened, ill, and facing slow recovery as normal conditions gradually returned. The psychological trauma of living through catastrophes, watching communities decimated by plague, seeing cities destroyed by war, enduring hunger during famines, affected everyone, including these marginalized women. They witnessed horror alongside everyone else and carried those traumatic memories throughout their lives. Unlike respectable citizens who might find comfort in family, community and religion, such women faced catastrophes without support systems, processing trauma alone or with only their fellow marginalised women to share the burden. The remarkable thing is that women survived these catastrophes at all. Their resilience in the face of events that would break most people demonstrates profound strength. They continued living, working, and enduring even after experiencing horrors that destroyed communities and killed massive percentages of populations. This survival wasn't heroic in any romantic sense. It was simply human beings refusing to give up even when circumstances seemed hopeless. And so, as we draw back from this exploration of difficult historical realities, we're left with a complex understanding of lives lived in circumstances most modern people can barely imagine. These women, daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, navigated a world that offered them few choices, while judging them harshly for the choices they made. Their daily existence was marked by physical discomfort, economic insecurity, social stigma, health risks, and constant vulnerability. They worked to survive in a society that condemned them, while simultaneously creating and maintaining the demand for their services. They faced double standards that blamed them exclusively for activities that required male participation. They lived without adequate legal protection, medical care, or social support, relying primarily on each other for whatever assistance and companionship they could find. Yet within these harsh realities they maintained their humanity. They formed friendships, showed kindness to others even worse off than themselves, loved their children fiercely despite inadequate resources to care for them, and found moments of joy and connection despite overwhelming hardship. Their resilience shouldn't be romanticised. They shouldn't have needed such resilience. But it does deserve recognition. The economic structures that created such desperate circumstances were fundamentally unjust. Medieval society offered women remarkably few ways to support themselves legitimately, paid them fractions of what men earned for similar work, and then condemned them for turning to one of the few activities where they could earn survival income. This system was designed to fail them, and condemning the women for failing within it represents a profound misunderstanding of how structural inequality operates. The religious condemnation these women faced was deeply hypocritical. Church teachings emphasized God's mercy, Christ's compassion for sinners, and the possibility of redemption, yet treated such women as irredeemable sinners worthy only of contempt. The same religious authorities who preached about helping the poor and marginalized often refused to extend that help to these women, viewing them as having placed themselves beyond mercy through their choices, ignoring that those choices were made under duress in situations offering no better alternatives. The legal frameworks that attempted to regulate this activity while denying women legal protections were fundamentally unjust. Authorities wanted to tax these women's earnings, control their movements, and enforce regulations upon them, while simultaneously denying them recourse when they were victims of crimes. This extraction of revenue and control without corresponding provision of protection represents a particularly cynical form of exploitation. Modern understanding recognises that these medieval women deserve to be remembered with dignity and their experiences acknowledged honestly. They were not moral failures or cautionary tales. They were people trying to survive in circumstances that would challenge anyone. Their stories remind us that marginalisation and exploitation have long histories, that economic desperation can force impossible choices, and that the most vulnerable members of society bear disproportionate costs of social dysfunction. The connections between medieval experiences and modern realities are both obvious and complex. Economic desperation still drives people into exploitative situations. Trafficking and coercion remain serious problems. Social stigma still marks those in such circumstances. Violence and health risks continue to threaten vulnerable individuals. Legal frameworks still struggle to balance the various concerns such situations raise. However, enormous progress has occurred in important areas. Modern medicine can prevent and treat diseases that were death sentences in medieval times. Contraception allows prevention of unwanted pregnancies with effectiveness medieval women couldn't imagine. Legal frameworks in many places now recognise the rights of individuals in such circumstances and attempt to provide protections. Social safety nets, educational opportunities, and expanded employment options for women mean that the desperation that drove medieval women into this work is less absolute today in many societies. Yet significant problems persist. The vulnerability of economically desperate people to exploitation remains. The double standards that judge women more harshly than men continue in modified forms. The tendency to blame individuals for structural failures persists. Understanding medieval experiences can foster empathy and highlight how little has been solved despite centuries of progress, motivating continued efforts to address exploitation and marginalization wherever they occur. The women whose lives we've explored existed at specific times in specific places, but they were part of ongoing human stories about poverty, survival, resilience, exploitation, judgment, and the struggle to maintain dignity in circumstances that assault it. Their specific experiences are gone, their names mostly lost, their individual stories unrecorded beyond fragmentary mentions in judgmental documents. But they were here, they lived, loved, struggled, and endured. They deserve to be remembered not as abstractions or morality tales, but as human beings who navigated impossible circumstances with whatever resources they possessed. Their legacy is a reminder that history isn't only about kings and battles, grand achievements and celebrated heroes. It's also about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, about survival against odds, about humanity persisting in circumstances that assault it. The medieval women who engaged in this work were part of communities, raised children who became part of future generations, contributed to the economic life of their societies in ways that weren't acknowledged, and left marks on history even though their names weren't recorded. In remembering them, we honour their humanity while also acknowledging the injustices they faced. We recognise that societies create circumstances that push vulnerable people into impossible situations, then often blame those people for the situations they're in. We commit to building better systems that offer genuine choices, provide real support, and recognise the fundamental dignity of all human beings regardless of their circumstances or choices. The medieval women whose day-to-day lives we've explored would likely appreciate not pity or condemnation, but simply the recognition that they were people who mattered, whose experiences were real, and whose struggles were part of the larger human story of survival, endurance, and the ongoing effort to create more just and compassionate societies for everyone.